Walaikum assalam, Rafi. Good to see you.
Okay, guys, so I think we've begun the recording. Let me begin with some opening remarks to contextualize the conversation for today, and then we'll get going. So, the river systems fed by the Hindu Kush and the Himalayan mountain ranges are shared by several neighboring countries across South, Central, and Western Asia. Increasing population pressures, agricultural demand, pollution, climate change are exacerbating friction between neighboring states, which are already experiencing water stress and water scarcity. The threat of potential conflict between nuclear armed India and Pakistan, sparked by disputes over the Indus River basin, remains an issue of concern, and it also, to a certain degree, evokes international concern. However, there are also brewing tensions and possibilities of growing tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan over sharing the Kabul River. And this is an issue which has not received the kind of attention that it merits. So, this Earth Day seminar being convened by the Middle East Institute aims to draw specific attention to water sharing challenges facing both the countries. And now, to discuss these various aspects related to the problem, we are joined today by a great panel of experts. We have with us today Dr. Salim Ali, who is a blue and gold distinguished professor of energy and the environment at the University of Delaware. Salim was elected to the UN International Resource Panel in 2017 and to the Science Panel of the Global Environment Facility in 2018. He is the author of many books, and he has worked with a lot of think tanks, also on issues concerning environmental diplomacy. We also have with us Dr. Iram Sattar, who is the Sustainable Water Management Program Lead and Water Diplomacy Track Leader at the Friedman School of Nutritional Science and Policy at Tufts University. Iram studies the institutional architecture of national and international development, particularly as it relates to the development of water resources. We also have with us Syed Hashmat Sadat, who is a hydraulic and water resources engineering specialist with a focus on river basin development and small and large dam development on domestic and shared water courses. Syed Hashmat has worked with multilateral and bilateral agencies in Afghanistan, but also in several other countries. And currently, he is affiliated with SWECO in Sweden. And finally, we have Rafi Alam, who is an environmental lawyer based in Lahore, Pakistan. Rafi has served as the chairman of the Lahore Waste Management Company, and he's been a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council and the Punjab Environmental Protection Council. So it's a great panel, and we are looking forward to an interactive discussion. So I will now invite the panelists in with a certain sequence to open up this discussion, and let's do so. Salim, perhaps first you, and then Iram, and then Syed and Rafi. In your opening remarks, if you could take us to that 30,000 degree view on water sharing concerns within the region, and then perhaps zoom in on the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, and and particularly with the current sort of geo-strategic concerns in the region. How do you see water and water sharing being an issue of concern?
Great. Thank you so much, Muhammad Ali. It's a pleasure to reconnect with the Middle East Institute. About 10 years ago, actually, I wrote a short piece for the Middle East Institute on transboundary environmental cooperation. And it's very opportune that you're having this event during Earth Day week. And in fact, with that lens, we should approach the water sharing issues in a novel way from what is usually happening at DC think tanks. A lot of times the water issue is framed as a security issue and only as a security issue rather as an environmental issue as well. So by that, I mean, often we get championing of agreements like the Indus Waters Treaty, which is not an environmental treaty, as it is often made out to be. It is very much a treaty that was crafted by engineers to divide up the waters, and it was a sort of a least common denominator approach to solve a problem at a particular time. Whereas an environmental agreement would be much more eco-regional in its approach. It would look at the watershed, it would look at the totality of the region, not just focus on particular political considerations of division. So it wouldn't just be dividing the waters, but rather looking at those opportunities for synergies as well. And I would hope that in the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, there could be an approach which is more integrative, which learns from some of the challenges that the Indus Waters Treaty has had, that has a long history, of course, in the region, and that the agreements that may be crafted in the future between Afghanistan and Pakistan are much more environmentally oriented. So, for example, Afghanistan does have an agreement with Iran over the Helmand River, which goes back to the 1970s. But that too was not deliberately crafted as an environmental agreement. However, there is an interesting component to that because there are wetlands that are watered by the Helmand. And because Iran and Afghanistan are both signatories to an international agreement on wetlands, which is the Ramsar Treaty on Wetland Protection, there has been actually communication more on environmental grounds between the two countries, even though they continue to have concerns over that river as well. So if you look at the big picture, and I'm going to share a map quickly just so that everyone has the context in this. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the geography, and as a professor of geography and spatial science, I should show a map for sure. So this is the river basin, the Kabul River Basin, just to give you context. And Kabul is quite unusual in that way that some of its tributaries are flowing from Pakistan in this way as well. And sort of there's an interweaving between the borders. And so you can see the context then of all these dams that are being proposed. And there's some which are already constructed, that is leading to some tensions. And Pakistan, of course, because of its demographic situation, being a very, much more populated country than Afghanistan, this leads to those kinds of ongoing questions about who has more right to water based on population versus where the water flows from. And this has been an ongoing controversy in international water law, which I'm sure other panelists can comment on. We have two lawyers on the panel as well. So this is the context. So I'll just stop there and I'll leave the map for people to ponder. And over to Hiram, I guess, right?
Wonderful, yes.
Thank you.
Iram, are you muted?
No, so I'm here now. Salim, would it be possible if we take away the map, because I think
yes, sure, no, okay, no problem.
And then I can see like everybody's face is better. So thank you so much. I just want to echo the thanks. I think this is a very valuable conversation. I think it's a timely conversation. So I'm going to approach this, just my initial comments, if I may, in a different perspective. So I'm going to try and put a few different things and then we'll see where we go with this conversation. So the main thing that I want to talk about is the fact that I think water is massively important and threatened, Muhammad Ali, as you pointed out. There's no doubt about it. There are population pressures, there are climate change pressures. But for me, when I look at the context of the Himalayan, Hindu Kush, Karakoram mountain ranges and their water flows, what strikes me as the most, as the thing that we should most fear is basically climate change in a very serious way, because there are now credible studies that at a sort of medium term ranges of warming, what likely happen is that half the glaciers may disappear by the mid-century mark, which is 2050, which is 30 years away. It's not that far away. And by 2100, which is again only 80 years away, it's not a long time in, as spans of time go, basically that up to 2/3 of the glaciers may melt. Now, there are some river systems, we saw a map, that come into the Indus in which glacial melt, particularly, this is not snow melt, but only glacial melt is up to 60% of the river's flow. So imagine a halving or a 2/3 reduction of 60% of your water supply. These are the threats that these countries live with. So I think what scares me is that there is an underappreciation of the impending calamity. There are also, so I'm going to add in a different way to what Dr. Salim Ali was saying, because he was saying, look, we must protect our ecosystems, and absolutely, right? Who can disagree with that? But what these countries most need, and the reason these things are justified, is that this is a technology we know, which is dam development, for the control of water supplies, to precisely protect us against the kinds of uncertainties that are coming down the line. So, if you have a store of water, that then you can sort of equal out flows, you can give people more certainty of supply. There's a lot of reasons for why human societies make dams.
So the glacial melt, is initially there's flooding, and then subsequently, water scarcity when the glacier has melted more. So that hence dams.
So yes, so there's a shorter term period in which it is predicted that there will be more floods as a result, but it's not entirely clear. Exactly. So if you think of a glacier as a water bank, right? Once it's gone, once it's melted and depleted, it's basically disappeared. So in the short term, there may be more melt, more devastation. As we know, Pakistan has been subject to several devastating floods. In fact, about every 3 years, there are large flood events in the Indus Basin, right? So there is great sort of harm that happens as a result of flooding, and flooding is on the up around the world. This is not just these two countries that are going to experience this problem. But on dam development, I just want to put the point which countries justify to make them, that look, this is a way of economic development. Now, there are huge devastating consequences of dams also that come, right? There are ecosystem changes. In fact, there's now very credible data that we know where if a dam is made and a lot of vegetation is buried under the water reservoir that we make, in fact, that there is a lot of methane emissions. And Dr. Salim Ali can probably tell us about this, right? And those methane emissions are in fact more scary for climate change. I mean, if you're really worried about climate change, right? So those methane emissions should also worry us and scare us. So I just want to put that big picture issue for us here. And then what Dr. Salim Ali sort of obviously also alluded to is population pressures. So there are population pressures, there are development pressures. How do you create a sustainable sort of foundation for society to thrive? But what I'm really more worried about, as dire as all of this is, and it is dire, these are changes that are underway. What I don't see is a seriousness. And I say this with I think a lot of responsibility. If I look at the leaders in both countries, and then if I look at the region more broadly, and then I look at the particular geopolitical context you asked us to be aware of, which is the departure in particular of the US from Afghanistan at the 20th anniversary mark, right? What will we be left with? What has been built and what has been left behind? But what will Afghanistan be able to sustainably develop with, right? What are the resources that are going to be left behind? So I see a lot of irresponsibility and I see a lot of institutional incapacity, even though there have been many attempts to try and negotiate on the Kabul, there is not enough institutional depth to have sustained engagement. Small, examples from other countries and other basins. I understand it's a very different context, but between Switzerland and France, for instance, they've been working on negotiating and trying to develop data and knowledge on a particular sort of shared river since the 80s. So these things take time. Trust building takes time, technical capacity takes time, and I don't know that we have put in the work. Meanwhile, we are facing an impending crisis that you can see is coming.
So work needed on both sides, and now I think it's a good segue to go to to Sayyid and also to sort of for him to think about sort of all these important issues in his opening remarks, right, vis-a-vis the Kabul River, and what perhaps has been done, what needs to be done to contend with some of these challenges, and then we'll begin unpacking each of these issues in subsequent detail. So over to you, Sayyid.
Thank you so much, Muhammad Ali, and I appreciate that having me on this important panel. So that is very true. If you look at it, river play a very important role of soul to the earth. So river can bring together the countries in states, and sometimes create conflicts between states. So, and currently, actually, the water has more official attentions since because of the climate change in population growth and in need of economic growth, in combating with pollution are the main driving factors that increase the demand of water for each countries and for each nation. So look at it like the Afghanistan and Pakistan predicament are not unique. If you look at it, in most of the transboundary rivers that I worked in Jordan River basins, in the Tigris and Euphrates River basins, in the Nile River basins, most of the conflicts are going on between the states. Even, some of them, they have treaties, but still, the implementation of the treaties has, challenge, in problem. So, for example, look at in the region like Bangladesh in India, the conflict and dispute, even they share like more than 45 transboundary rivers, but the officials like heavily concentrated on the Ganges River. And look at it, I can call this like very close, down to between Pakistan and India, despite of the 1960 treaty, have political and technical contentions over the endings, lack of trust, lack of sharing their development plans between each other, and also on unilateral interventions, environmental flow, lack of environmental flow consideration, degradation of environmental environment at both sides of the river, particularly at the Kashmir areas, and also sometimes their dispute reach, to the International Court of Justice, like the case of the Kishinkanga in Rattle hydropower in 2016. So these are, the main challenges. It's not only, to me, in my view, treaties and agreements or accord or pact, can solve the issue of water between the countries, but that can be used as a tool. But, still the trust, political will, commitment, these are the most important aspects that, that to how the ground environment should be more prepared, that they should cooperate over the water between each other. Like, I'm a bit, more specific, coming down to narrow down this. For example, Islamabad believes that that the planned dams on the Kabul River basin, definitely or are in its tributaries will squeeze the flow of water to Pakistan. But look at it, the same time, where Pakistan itself has adopted, unilateral water development strategy, constructing several dams on Chatra River basin. And Chatra River, which is, the origination or originate of the Kunnar River, which is the major tributary of the Kavod River basin. So, like both countries, have unilateral development, in interventions in the basin. So this, increase competitions in the natural, in national interest is one of a major concern that each state, look at it, for their own growth in economic development. And coming, to the point of this institutional development in Afghanistan, or weaknesses or capacity, that is true. Look at Afghanistan for the last 40 years, war in adversities, definitely, infrastructure can be affected. And but despite Afghanistan's now evolving in terms of institutional capacity in development, in reforming, like recently, splitting up the water energy water and energy ministry into two authorities, the water and energy. That is actually, a good move, that they will, focus more on the water, and then the energy will, focus on the energy sector. And also establishing the river basin authorities is also, a good sign of capacity building, or means moving in terms of institutional development. And also establishing some other supplementary institution that will support, the water sector in Afghanistan, like Afghanistan National Water and Environment Research Institute.
This is wonderful, Sayed. This is actually wonderful, and I'm going to come back to you. When we, particularly when we talk about the damming, but I thought it was based on what you'd said earlier, about the shape of the river as well, right? Which is kind of this way where it's simultaneously both countries are upper and lower riparian at the same time, right? I mean, a point.
Exactly.
Emphasizing, and
exactly.
So both feel that, hey, I mean, the problems with water being released into into each other country. But please finish your remark, and then we'll hand it over to.
No, I will conclude my remarks that there is no doubt that the formalizing agreements between neighboring countries over water usage will go a long way towards preventing conflicts. But at the same time, I emphasize this on the effective implementation of the water treaties and agreements. For example, Dr. Salim mentioned about Iran and Afghanistan. We have that signed treaty, like Afghanistan with Iran in 1973 treaty. But due to poor implementation of the treaty, they have, a lot of concerns, and a lot of, accusing each other. But another issue is the poor water governance on both countries. In poor water governance, poor water management is another aspect that, can hinder water cooperation between the states.
So Rafi, we have, already, I think the panel has preempted many of my questions, and the issue of climate has come in, the issue of, the need for good governance and management, water management practices, institutional capacities. So, in your opening remarks, I mean, you can, you're welcome to, address all of these issues, and perhaps, also explain to us, so here in the US, and several years ago, and this was the military establishment saying that, climate is a threat multiplier. So, it takes, wherever you have friction, it worsens that friction, right? So it multiplies the threats. So how does this, I mean, we realize the implications perhaps in the Indian-Pakistani context, but, if we're thinking of this fraught, peace process the exit of sort of, donor, perhaps, I mean, one wants to see what the responsible exit is going to look like, right? But given sort of, Pakistan and Afghanistan's relationship over the past and where it might be heading in the future, and then on top of this, we have this ominous impending threat of climate, how do you see all these, developments?
Thank you, Muhammad Ali, for inviting me. It's indeed a privilege to be able to speak about this issue. Well, I wanted to start by saying that the Indus Treaty is a fantastic example of proving that water sharing agreements or transboundary water sharing agreements don't actually result in the reduction of tensions between countries. The Indus Treaty is quite remarkable that way, because as a lawyer, my understanding is that treaties prevent wars. But here we have a transboundary water sharing agreement that's actually hailed for surviving wars. It's sort of putting logic on its head. But I want to address some of the legal aspects when it comes up, or some of the aspects that come up when we discuss having or wanting to have a treaty. Both Afghanistan and Pakistan are water stressed, but similarly and very differently. Pakistan, they say the per capita water availability is about 1,000 cubic meters per person per year and dwindling. In Afghanistan, it's much higher. It's over 2,000. However, there's no water infrastructure to stop that water from draining into rivers and then exiting the country. All 5 of the rivers in Afghanistan are transboundary. Water is essentially a transboundary issue in Afghanistan. It's also a transboundary issue in Pakistan, but for very different reasons. Pakistan only has one river basin, the Indus, and it's transboundary. So it's existential for us in a way that it's different for Afghanistan. And I think we need to appreciate the characteristics of the basins that we're talking about before we can even begin to talk about how we can cooperate on them. The Kabul River itself is a collection of 3 sub-basins, the upper and lower Kabul and the Panjshir. And of these, actually, it's really just the Konar River that flows from Pakistan into Afghanistan that carries most of the water. Water in that part of Afghanistan, in the Kabul River, is really where everything is. And most of the population of Afghanistan is focused in that basin. So that water is valuable for domestic purposes. It's valuable for agriculture, although there's very little space for agriculture, given the topography of the region. And it's also important for hydropower energy for the region. And in the Pakistani side, the Kabul River is 15% of total flows into the Indus, and also provides some water. I think, what is it? I forget the name of the dam in KP that provides water for irrigation, and it's about 25-30 megawatts of electricity as well. We have to understand that if there is going to be hydropower development in Afghanistan, it might not prejudice Pakistan at all. Because you can't make huge hydropower storage, you can't make huge storage dams in Afghanistan. The topography really doesn't allow for it. And you might make run-of-the-river dams, which could be beneficial to Pakistan. You see, what Afghanistan is short of is actually electricity during the winter months, and a dam on the Kunar would be very valuable for that. And what Pakistan needs in the summer is flows in the Kabul. And a steady storage in Afghanistan would provide for that. But this is not to say Pakistan doesn't need electricity and Afghanistan doesn't need the water. They do. But these might be areas where you want to talk about cooperation. The tendency, given the path dependency in Pakistan with the Indus Treaty and its securitization, is to think of transboundary water through the lens of security and tension and conflict, when in reality that shouldn't be the case. As Idam rightly pointed out, the true horror facing us right in the eye is the climate crisis. Elite Pakistan did a transboundary Afghanistan-Pakistan study a few years ago, and they found that even with some of the more extreme climate scenarios, the RCP 8.5 and so on, you're going to lose most of the water where these dams can potentially be built. So really, the time span for constructing most of these hydropower dams also coincides when the water is going to run out. So at some level, the real problem is actually climate change. It's not the security or the fact that transboundary water will lead to conflict and so on and so forth, which is also a narrative that needs to be re-examined, because frankly, in history, water and transboundary water has been a cause of cooperation rather than conflict. And it's this repeated looking and insisting that there is a conflict over here potentially, when there might not be in reality, when in reality there's actually greenfield policy areas that you could cooperate on. So I'll stop over here, and maybe there's some other comments and stuff that I could respond to.
Yeah, I mean, very, very interesting. I mean, because one's been, reading concerns of how India's, help to the damming of the Kabul River has also become a political issue. But, there's plenty to unpack here. And I think the next big issue that we can perhaps, moving in that direction of the Shahtoot Dam, right? And there are technical aspects, and I suspect different perceptions on both sides in terms of how that's going to impact flows. But alongside that, I mean, one also wonders, and this perhaps speaks to the issues of institutional capacity building and water governance policies. And I mean, if we pull in, the role of the donor community, right? So how Salim in the beginning had commented on, this much lauded Indus Basin Treaty, which was basically, dividing rivers this way and that way, which is not this kind of ecological integrated basin approach that has, subsequently been articulated. So, forget that challenge of that challenge of updating or revising the Indus Basin. But what are some of the lessons, when it comes to Kabul, and trying to be a bit practical also, because we see, a country torn by conflict, 40 years, suspicions on both sides, the role of donors, whatever. I mean, one's heard tangentially of multilaterals trying to look at this issue, but there hasn't been a hard brokering of water treaties with any of the, I mean, forget Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also with the Central Asian countries. So, given this scenario, Salim, how do you feel as someone who advocates, environmental diplomacy? How do you see these issues?
Well, I think the point about the role of investment in any kind of infrastructure solutions that are being proposed and where that investment comes from is pivotally important in domestic politics. And there is a question also about this around the role of the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank in furthering these agendas. Keep in mind that the Indus Waters Treaty was negotiated through the World Bank, and there was an American engineer involved, David Lilienthal from the Tennessee Valley Authority, and also, there's a history of that sort of donor-driven treaty engagement in the Indus Waters case, and that led to all kinds of domestic policy implications. The same we see in Africa that Said was mentioning with the Nile and the involvement of China and some of the dams there, that leads to certain domestic issues. We are seeing that with the Shahtoot also, and particularly when there is such a fraught relationship, unfortunately, between India and Pakistan, that any investment in another neighboring country is going to be seen with suspicion. So I think there needs to be some attention to those elements of how this infrastructure investment is framed. There also needs to be a recognition, which I totally agree with in terms of what both Rafi and Iram have said, that we have to have a long-term planning horizon when we are developing infrastructure and large dams, especially. And with climate change, there is absolutely going to be this pressure on the water flow from the Himalayas. The models are pretty clear on that. There is uncertainty. There's not a definitive case that there's going to be a complete depletion, but it seems quite likely that there will be major reduction. And so then you have to think about what kind of infrastructure is appropriate. Large impoundment dams, which are also going to cause resettlement of populations in very densely populated areas, they do not make much sense. They tend to be these prestige projects, much more measured, small-scale hydro run-of-the-river projects which is some of what is being suggested on the Kabul as well, they make a bit more sense. So I think this is where we need to be, really the devil is in the detail, and we need to pay much more attention to what exactly specifically is being proposed. And we should think of it in what, now in the academic literature, we call the water, energy, food nexus. And there is this interplay, it's a complex system whereby ultimately, for especially countries like Afghanistan, which do have a lot of subsistence farming, we have to think about the food security issues. We have to consider the role water plays in that, and then the demands for energy, and then alternative energies too. So then, what is the role for wind and solar, for example? In a place like Afghanistan, there is a lot of potential actually for that. And so what mix can that play? Natural gas is going to be an important transition fuel as well. There have been, of course, arguments around other gas infrastructure. There's still the gas pipeline that has been proposed. I know for climate change, it's a very, tricky issue, but for baseload power, we will most likely need to have some kind of natural gas investment, because solar and wind cannot provide it adequately. Even hydropower cannot provide it adequately until we have very good battery storage for the solar and wind energy. And we do not have yet the battery infrastructure, which Elon Musk is working on, but it's still a long way to go before we can use it in that context. So it's part of this larger puzzle of the food, energy, water nexus.
So, Iram, I mean, thinking of damming perhaps not as being the greatest solution, the possibility of thinking of gas as this kind of, interim as we move towards greener energies, and the potential therein, I mean, be it in Pakistan, be it in Afghanistan, but what we then getting into is not only water management and governance related issues and cross-border sharing, but also thinking of energy mixes, right? And therein we have other broader, I mean, to go back to that earlier framing of geostrategic developments, I mean, not only do we have an exiting American situation, and let's see what that means in terms of donor commitments to Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also China's role, right? I mean, with its big sort of investments, and it's already got it's got its interests in terms of precious metals and other things in Afghanistan. So, do you see some movement in the right direction, or do you see more missed opportunities?
So I think, as you said earlier, before you were sort of introducing remarks, there is a lot to unpack there. And maybe what I'll also do is pick up on a few of the comments of sort of, other speakers. The water, food, and energy nexus, I really want to pick up on also, because that's a very serious crisis. At the moment, there has been a minimal snowpack in the mountains of Afghanistan. And there is a major drought that is subsequently going to develop, again, because there is not that storage infrastructure for capturing whatever melt there is. Potatoes, for instance, which are a staple crop of the diet, it's a threatened crop at the moment. And it is unsure what food security will look like in Afghanistan. Now, food security is something that is also about national security. So maybe one of the things that I want to try and put on the table is to have a broader conception of national security, because I'm per se not against the national security framework. I think that gets a lot of people interested. I think in many ways, the national security community, at least in the US, has been a very responsible actor, even when it's talking about threat multipliers. The fact is, it is doing it based on a recognition of the fact that environmental change does impact people's lives. It impacts their choices in life and where they live and what can they do, right? So if small farmers, for instance, are not going to be able to have a potato crop that is going to sustain them in the months ahead, are they going to migrate further into urban areas? So is that going to create more urban pressures? We saw it happen in Syria with the drought, We have seen it happen in country after country. At the moment, last year, we were seeing major influx from places like Guatemala and El Salvador into the United States, again, because there was a blight on the potato crops, which is what small farmers' food security is in sort of these topographies based on, right? That's what they do. Now, prices are low. So food security is a huge problem. Now, food security happens, one, because there is a reduction in supply, but also because we have a lack of storage. We have a lack of transport. We have a lack of being able to get the products that farmers produce to market so that they can get prices adequate so that they can live on them. So I think if we can have, and I'm seeing a change, for however you want to take whatever the new geo-economics pivot of the Pakistani state is as it is being announced, the fact is that they are saying that they are interested in this kind of pivot. So if we can start thinking about national security more broadly as human, social, environmental, socioeconomic security, then maybe we all have a basis for a common discussion. So I think that's something that we can advance, or we can all try and advance and say this is integrated. Just to pick up on one other small point that Dr. Ali made, which is absolutely right. So any kind of sort of reliable power supply, you need base load. So how you do base load and how that gives us energy security is also going to be a critical problem that societies will have to challenge. It's obviously not easy, but that base load, battery power, storage problem is a critical issue. I mean, I live in sort of, Massachusetts and New England. And if you look at the energy mix in New England, even at the moment, you can like check it, right? There's an app for it. You can go look at what's my energy mix at the moment. About 30%, and I don't want to advance this, but I want to sort of be realistic. About 30%, even at the moment, will be nuclear power. Now that's a lot. That's not a small, tiny percentage, even of New England, right? So where you can say, well, this is like a developed part of the world, right? So these are realistic problems that countries face. And just lastly, I'll just pick up on what you alluded to, because I think that's a very big game changer, especially as you said, the China factor, right? So the China factor, China is very interested in moving west into Asia, right? So there is a movement west of China. That's how it is seeing its future, that whole Belt and Road initiative that it's making, of which the crown jewel is supposed to be the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, right? The CPEC corridor, which is full of a lot of investments coming in. So I know there was a question about the role of the multilateral development finance institutions, such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. But I think one of the things that we have to start considering is the role of China as it is coming with infrastructure finance in particular, and what that will mean for the kinds of infrastructure that will then subsequently get developed. Because China has a big build bias, right? That's what it thinks countries need. That's what its export capacity is, its surplus capacity in terms of its companies, in terms of its manpower, is in construction. Let's make big things. And I think what we need to try and pivot that money towards is say, yes, absolutely, building is important, but you need a lot of institutional governance reform also. And the other thing is there is also, as we know, a couple of years ago, China led the development, and Pakistan and Afghanistan are both members, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? So this is the new investment bank framework that's on the cards. And what it does also, in addition to what the World Bank and the ADB have long done, is something that I think we need to look at very closely.
Okay, wonderful. So Syed, if you now think of ongoing developments in the water sector in Afghanistan, how do you view sort of donor engagements? You'd mentioned some of the institutional developments and the articulation of, different departments and authority for water basins, which is all good news. But in terms of, how the direction in which Afghanistan is going and the kinds of donors it sees have this long-term commitment, and does it see a divergence in in the approaches of different donors, right? I mean, we know that the World Bank approaches in the water sector, for instance, I mean, we've alluded to Indus Basin Treaty, but I mean, or the market-based approaches to water management, right? So, I mean, how do you see some of these, issues? Do you see all the donors being on the same page? How do you see, given the current uncertainty, what kind of challenges besides climate? There's also an unfortunate real threat of conflict, right? So,
Yeah.
and if you then unpack, that, I mean, with the growing stress that's being felt, in terms of water needs, I mean, per capita, it might not be as precarious a situation, but, with the confluence of climate and conflict. So what are the challenges there, and what grounds of hope do you see?
Yeah, no, exactly. In general, if you look at it, most of the riparian countries within the sheer water courses, their development plans are not in proportional with the water availability in the basin. But their development plans always, depends or in line with their economic development, which is not actually correct. Because each country should think about how much water available in the basin or in the river. So and then they think how they can develop their economic growth. And for example, look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, both of them agrarian countries. And agriculture, play a central role in both countries' economy. Like 45% of employment, in Pakistan comes from agriculture, and more than 70%, in Afghanistan come from the agriculture. So definitely both of them, required that, how to efficiently manage, water resources. As mentioned before, the water, food, the water, energy and food nexus is one of the most flashing point now elsewhere. So these are the most important aspects that, the country should think that how they efficiently develop and govern, water resources within the basins that do not harm the environment, and as well not degrade the environment and not harm, the right of downstream country or other, riparian states. Like also, doing in how we can, ensure the support of the international donors, or financer. One of them is agreement in consensus, with the riparian countries. Look at it, like these current development in Afghanistan, none of them are supporting by international development because of the notification later required from the downstream countries when any interventions on development going to be happen in Kabul River Basin or any other basins in Afghanistan. So this is one of important, that to build their capacity, to build on the knowledge and learn new technologies and develop the institutions, and also establish, reach, the agreements with the parent countries. So to ensure and ensure the trust of the donors actually to support such as development. For example, even nowadays, the donors has policy that if the downstream countries, develop any water infrastructures, the upstream country should be notified, and not only the downstream country. So in the mutual, understanding and agreement and consensus are required, that to bring actually, to have the trust of donors.
Right. Let me ask you a more specific question. When it comes to the Shahtut Dam, right? Why was it? Because India has been, in the past several years, it's been given the scale of the country. I mean, it's contributed significantly. I mean, even if it's $1 billion or so in terms of aid for India, that's a significant commitment. So like China, it's building its portfolio as a donor, but it's its largest commitment to Afghanistan. So understanding how how in that process, in Afghanistan being an agrarian country, it's interested in helping develop the irrigational infrastructure. But within the Afghan government, were there attempts made to sort of bring in other donors? Because surely there must have been a realization that this might trigger some alarm bells on the other side. And it's not to say that the Afghan government and the Pakistan government have been on the best of terms, unfortunately, right? Which are all political realities when we have to think about this. So what is your view in particular, since you have this technical background on the Shahtut Dam itself?
Well, like as I mentioned before, like international financiers, will not support any development, when there is no notification and agreement. That is very clear. So that is why, that they receive, funds from India. That is completely a different scenario and a different issue. Coming, to Shahtut Dam, there is no any construction, physical construction now. It's a modification of the design going on based on my recent experience from Kabul, and geotech survey is going on. But from hydrological point of view, in water flow point of view, Shahtut Dam is located on Maidan River. The Maidan River is a small stream tributary for the upper or upstream reach of Kabul Basin, which the upstream reach of Kabul Basin has 2% contribution to the entire flow of the basin. So there is nothing, will be harmful, to Pakistan, by construction of this this dam. And also the storage capacity of this dam is like 0.008% of the entire annual average flow of the basin. And also similarly, as I totally agree with Rafi, that he mentioned, in general, Pakistan dependency to Afghanistan or to Kabul River is very limited, because the contribution of the Kabul River basin is only 16 to 17% to the entire water supply of Pakistan. So there will be no harmful. There was no a very large impact on the construction of this dam to the lower riparian states, like let's say Pakistan.
Okay, wonderful.
But just Mohammed Ali, one quick point is that with numbers, you have to be very careful, because, even though the contribution of the Kabul is 15, 16%, locally where it is contributing in KP province, that's a very high population growth area. And for that area, it is still very critical. And you can't, when you say 15%, you can't move water around that easily. We don't want to end up like Arizona, where they're building massive canals just because they want to supply water to population centers and create havoc on ecological issues. So it's important to be careful with the numbers. But I think the other number about the Shahtut Dam's footprint in Afghanistan is a good one, that it's a small tributary and it's not going to have a major impact. The reason Pakistan is creating more of a scene about it is because of the financing. As I said, the domestic politics, anything coming from India into Afghanistan is seen with suspicion. Perhaps it shouldn't be. There can be a regional dialogue on that. I think that's fair. I think India and China are not comparable, much as they want to compare themselves. Their financial resources, their domestic poverty concerns are absolutely not comparable, and probably will not be for the next 50 years. So I think we need to take it with some, greater clarity on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just one point. the numbers are, more adequate, in terms of, when we are saying the flow or the discharge, because most of the Kabul River Basin discharge comes from Konner River. That's very clear. But, these are more at the upstream reach, like 16% or 20% comes from the upstream and 80% comes from the lower reach, which is the Konner River. So definitely, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa will receive, sufficient water still. But even, like I can say these 6 dams that planned, the Gulbar Dam, this Konner Dam, this Shatu Dam, and 3-4 others dam, based on the World Bank study on our project in 2013, only will contribute or reduce 3% of the total inflow in the Kabul River Basin. So the impact will be very low, and because of the upper reach, in the middle reach doesn't have that much discharge.
So Rafe, now you had earlier and rightly said that, these framings are important, right? And I mean, it unfortunately creates this hype, and this hype is not only, in Pakistan. I mean, it seems that even in Iran now on the Helmand, there's concern now. I mean, that treaty was never really operationalized past 40 years, but now with talks of damming, there's concern also on that side. In fact, there's been barbs traded of
25 cusecs of water. Yeah, there's hardly anything to dam there anymore. Once again, the framing makes us forget the numbers and the scale that we're operating under. The Shatut Dam that you're talking about will provide drinking water and sanitation to the capital of Afghanistan, which is a city that's been at war for the last 20 years. I would imagine that once the American forces and allied forces leave, everyone in the region would cooperate and make sure that at least the capital and its people had clean drinking water, instead of pointing fingers as to where the donor money was coming from. And that's what the framing does. It really throws off what should be important and what isn't important. What is also difficult is when you talk about how things should be. I'm a great believer in integrated water management. I'm a great believer in understanding the ecology and ecosystem of the basin before you do something with it. But think for a moment, if you were to have a transboundary arrangement between Afghanistan and Pakistan over the Kabul River, which flows to the Indus, which at a subnational level in Pakistan is claimed by the province of Sindh. Do you think that the irrigation authorities in Sindh would be amenable to speak to irrigation authorities in Afghanistan over water sharing, given the fact that the two countries have been at war and there's been diplomat? No, not at all. There's no capacity to do so. In fact, integrated water management is it's actually one of those pipe dreams that we talk about, but actually can't happen. Even if you were to think about bringing all the riparians into some sort of, holistic water sharing agreement where you bring China and Afghanistan into it. Well, India's position on foreign relations has insisted on bilateralism since the Simla Accord in 1972. What are you going to do? Bring 2 or 3 other parties onto the table with them? They're not going to do it, because being part of a regional agreement would basically mean that the position that they take with China with respect to the Brahmaputra would be untenable with respect to the position it takes with its rivers and in respect to Pakistan. It puts it into a diplomatic sort of jigsaw of sorts. So even the best case scenario, the wishful thinking, is filled with impracticalities. And it really is a challenge going forward, because the frameworks and legal frameworks and treaty arrangements that we've had in the past are wearing thin in the face of the climate crisis. And we really don't have anything tangible to work with going forward.
No, just to this point, I think Rafe is giving us a good reality check in terms of the domestic politics context in each of these countries. However, I think we should be thinking big. If you are concerned about the climate crisis, as you are, Rafe, very much and very genuinely, then we have to think big. Yes, it is right now, it seems impractical that we can have an eco-regional approach. But one of the things under the Paris Agreement, and as well as many other international efforts now, is to inculcate that kind of eco-regional approach with the climate lens. So to get these countries to recognize that in order to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, they will have to cooperate at some level. And that may require, let us see what happens in Glasgow later this year, but that may require, now that the US is playing a more leadership role, it may require some further maneuvering on those matters from the major powers. It may require also perhaps to bring in some of the other treaties to which both countries, in the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, are signatories to as well, whether it's CBD or Ramsar and so on. So yes, you're absolutely right. In the short term, it's unrealistic, but we need to at least have that longer term vision that it could be possible. And I have seen that dynamics change. In Southern Africa, where I did work a long time ago, I still continue to work. The Zambezi river, which was dammed in the same sort of the Cold War period, the Kariba Dam was built. There was no eco-regional approach to water management. And the countries there was civil war in Mozambique and Angola. It was a complete mess. But eventually, they have come to a much more eco-regional approach in the Zambezi, more so than people would have thought. So I still hold hope that it's possible in South Asia.
So Salim, let me ask you this, and this, I mean, there's a history to this because we have been working on the US-Pakistan bilateral relationship and talking about prescriptions, and I mean, there hasn't been a lot of work done on a reconstruction opportunity zone, which is an economic corridor between Pakistan and Afghanistan and the US, providing market access. So that perhaps will have more precedent over the environment. But, I mean, if we had the ear of policymakers, right, and particularly now that Pakistan has been invited in, as an afterthought, or perhaps, I mean, it's encouraging to see that, some better sense prevailed, and it's going to be at the climate summit. And there is on everyone's mind, Afghanistan remains a priority, right? And Pakistan's role in that, and thinking of, trying to, walk through that minefield of, of trying to create stability, which should be, good for both sides, besides the economic, like in terms of environmental collaboration and cooperation, what role can or should, the US play, which has a legacy issue in Afghanistan, and perhaps working with regional partners, and this is perhaps for Salim, perhaps for Iram or other panelists as well. But, I mean, given where I think the reality of where things stand now, so are these the issues? Would the suggestion be to try and put in place these kind of, ecological, create these ecological corridors, work on sort of, water? I mean, if the Shatut Dam is not such a big deal, then what would be, practical issue for donors? I mean, USAID has been working on Kabul, water infrastructure since a while, but there's a graveyard of, development projects and their vis-a-vis their efficiency. So, given all these issues, what would we try to, have as a prescriptive moving forward on trying to address some of these issues? Salim,
yeah, I mean, I think the US has a lot of influence in the region still, not as much as it did maybe a decade ago, but and China's role is going to be critically important. I think what happens in terms of the US-China relationship is, for me, the most concerning. If the US and China are able to move beyond this kind of competitive rhetoric in geopolitics. I mean, they have the competitive rhetoric in terms of their manufacturing and some of the industrial efforts in each country, which is fine. But when it comes to geopolitics, if they start a competitive relationship, then I think South Asia will be the region that could potentially suffer the most in this kind of dynamic. So my hope is that that there is going to be some rapprochement at a level where they can engage productively in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where I do think both countries do have a common goal of peace and stability. I don't think either country would want the situation to deteriorate. So that's going to be important, and it will require some statesmanship. We still do not have a US ambassador in Pakistan. It's not even listed on the list of nominees. I'm concerned that the US has not given that priority to Pakistan right now for a variety of reasons that have to do with perhaps distractions that the current US administration has, but it could also have to do with other factors in terms of the Quad, for example, that has been built as well separately. So I think that's, for me, the most important is the US-China relationship and how that will play in.
So, we'll take another 10 minutes or so and then wrap up. Iram, of course, I'm coming to you. I was just gonna throw in, another perhaps, is this even a possibility? Because I've read, people talking about, if if these countries play it right, and if there's an enabling environment, the Kabul River going, the same reason perhaps that brought the Russians, to Afghanistan, because the Kabul River and, going all the way to the Arabian Sea as a maritime corridor. So, perhaps yourself and then Rafi, and given all the work that would require, and, is that like an end goal that might motivate, Sayed, cooperation on these sides? So, in your concluding remarks, and then we can, we can cap this session.
Okay, happy to pick that up. What I was actually trying to also respond to is this idea, which is of this geopolitical competition, which I think is going to be very, very important. If you look at the link between domestic US politics and its foreign policy infrastructure, one of the things that the new Secretary of State, Blinken, has said is that they are really interested in connecting the foreign policy of the US to domestic priorities. Now, that's a very interesting puzzle. Again, as maybe has been pointed out, how do you solve that problem, right? So within the US, as we know, the Biden administration has just proposed a massive, what they're calling a jobs plan, which is $2.3 trillion, infrastructure, creation of jobs, green energy, all kinds of things. So there is a conflict. The conflict is that if the US, especially also in both its bilateral support and through the work of the multilateral finance organizations in which it's a major player, is unwilling to support the kind of infrastructure development that developing countries, low-income countries, especially countries in South Asia, want and are demanding as a way to grow. Meanwhile, the US is convinced that on the domestic front, what it needs is infrastructure upgradation, right? So it's almost as if your domestic audience, you want to push this, and then for the international global audience that you work with, you're saying, well, no, don't align with China, which is doing precisely what we want to do here at home. And you say you need also, now I'm talking about on the low income country side, right? So China as the investor, the countries as the loan takers, as the infrastructure developers. So it's hard. And I just want us to recognize that this is how do you square that circle, right? How do you say to low income countries that are at low levels of development, that need to do a lot of development, as it is traditionally understood, that what is not okay for you is okay for us to do at home?
But Aaron, there's another little irony there with CPEC as well, right? So as China is now making these very impressive commitments to climate, those are largely domestic. right? And there's still a concern that, be it CPEC with the coal sort of and other energy projects and infrastructure and BRI, they aren't super green, right? And
you point to a really good idea, a really good point, right? That no one here is consistent, unfortunately, right? So when you think of like an ecological approach or a long-term sustainable approach, right? How do you build human security more broadly, as well as don't destroy? I mean, it's these ideas of sustainable development that have been knocking around the development community for decades, right? I mean, since before Rio, we were talking about this. So the ideas are not consistent. And I think if we want to think of, well, what could the US do now that it is saying it wants to reclaim its global space, its global leadership space, right? This climate summit is part of, beginning that process leading up to Glasgow and beyond. What it could do is it could try and support more ecological approaches towards sustainability. If you connect, there is a lot of, as it were, sort of like a different way, right? So in the US, there are several dams, for instance, that are being taken away, in that dams are being deconstructed, right? Because the idea is that they're destroying ecologies, they're destroying salmon runs, spawning grounds, etc., right? So for very different reasons. I think what the US could start saying is really try and collaborate and connect not just the older the older technocrats that we've had connected over the last several decades, right? That have come from, the World Bank and USAID, etc. But a different kind of environmental community within the United States could begin to connect with communities across South Asia to say, maybe we can start building differently from the get-go, instead of going into all of these problems that are impending. As Rafi very clearly said, right? Dam sites will become untenable. They will become unviable. So what's the point of sinking billions and trying to create all of this big mess, which will not yield the long-term sustainable results that you need? So I think the US has an opportunity. And I think sort of low-income countries, especially in South Asia, we should try and really lobby the US that says, no, we demand a different kind of development. And yes, if you are a genuine partner on that, come. Otherwise, there is nothing stopping countries from going towards China. It would make no sense to not just rush to that investment coming and take it and deal with the outcomes several generations later.
so before I go to Saad, I'll just make a quick note also. I mean, we opened up the Q&A panel. I don't see many more questions. I mean, we'd already addressed what we saw earlier. So I don't see many of my students, but this is recorded. And I mean, at least for human security, it's going to be compulsory viewing. But if I just wanted to flag that in case anyone else wants to ask questions, otherwise we are, capping this up for now. And of course, it'll be recorded and then circulated elsewhere. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, just one quick point that, the international communities or any international facilitators, can support and help the countries that, that how they can, come together and start the negotiation or discuss or have a consensus, over their shares. But, one of the golden rule is that countries must own the process of discussion and negotiation, because the outside actors, cannot help that much. That is one of the golden rules within the transboundary water management perspective. And also the process is matters, that the countries that how, to work together, how, how do they build the trust, and how, their political will and commitments, that bring them together, that to sit and discuss. These are the most important actually points that, within the sheer water course, that countries that, bring and discuss these points actually and consider, not, expecting, from the outsiders. And another things that, most of the riparian countries, or especially in Afghanistan and Pakistan, their mode of discussion or concern is physical water sharing. But I think in my view, I think the water benefit sharing is most actually pivotal and also will pave the environment and ground further cooperation and negotiation rather than to go to the physical water sharing. For example, the large dam in large infrastructures, that to support the both countries' economic development, will bring the countries together to sit and discuss and to reach a consensus.
All right. Yeah, well, fingers crossed for that. And Rafe, over to you.
Thank you, Muhammad Ali. I'd like to conclude with a very brief sort of note. When we did this lead study, I was involved with it as well. It was over the course of 18 months, and we had to travel to different countries because of the security problems in Islamabad and Kabul to be able to meet one another. We realized we did not know what the problem was. We don't know what the basin and its characteristics are. We don't know what the hydrology is. The data is very poor, it's very weak, it's outdated. And really, before one leaps into a transboundary agreement, there is huge space for studies. Maybe a transboundary research institute where academics and practitioners can both learn, funded, for example, by donors, would provide an understanding of the basin and how it's connected to society and provide the people of both countries and perhaps even the region with the tools, information, and data needed to be able to make the arguments for themselves and others in cooperation.
Absolutely. Well, that gives us a research proposal idea.
Well, I might mention that, I mean, there is a sort of organization like that, which is ISI mode, but it's very focused, right? That's the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, which was established for, the regional Himalayan ecosystem. And they do a lot of good work, but they are, of course, often confined by the donors. And so, for example, they have done some work on transboundary conservation areas, and they had no conservation area between India and Pakistan in the entire study. And I was shocked because I said, you can't tell me there's no transboundary conservation along the Indian-Pakistani border, which deserves attention. They said, no, the donors didn't want us to look into it. So, they are unfortunately confined, but if their mandate was improved, and as Rafe is suggesting, whether there could be a more focused and sharpened approach on water, they could be an important entity to help in this regard. They're based in Kathmandu, which is happily a neutral relative location. So
yeah, water, and then other, I mean, be it Sar Creek or, along this porous border, I mean, all these other possibilities for ecological, conservation, etc. So, so wonderful, guys. Thank you so much for your time. And, I certainly learned a lot, in this discussion, and thank you for taking the time out for it.